What becomes of an empire built on silence when the silence itself is sold? Before we descend into this story, if you find value in these journeys through forgotten corridors and hidden histories, consider subscribing. Your support brings us closer to 1,000 and closer to uncovering more of what powerful men preferred buried. The night of June 13th, 2012, settled over Mexico City with the weight of an ending no one yet understood. In the boardrooms of Grupo Modelo's headquarters on Avenida Javier Barros Sierra, lights burned late into the early hours. Security personnel moved through marble corridors with unusual frequency. Somewhere in the upper floors, documents changed hands. Signatures dried on paper that would sever nearly a century of Mexican brewing dominance. The official announcement would come the following morning. Anheuser-Busch InBev, the Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate, had acquired full control of Grupo Modelo for $20 billion. The transaction was framed as a merger of equals, a strategic alignment, a global opportunity. The press releases spoke of synergies and market expansion. What they did not mention was that an era had ended, quietly, deliberately, without public mourning. Pablo Diaz-Fernandez had been dead for more than 4 decades by then. The Spanish immigrant who had transformed a struggling brewery into a national institution never witnessed the final chapter. Yet his presence lingered in the architecture of the company he built, in the culture of discretion he established, in the very walls of the estates his fortune constructed across Mexico City. The Modelo headquarters itself stood as testament to a philosophy of contained ambition. Unlike the glass towers of multinational competitors, the building maintained a deliberate restraint. Its facades revealed nothing of the decisions made within. Visitors described an atmosphere of permanent vigilance, employees who spoke in measured tones, corridors where footsteps echoed against policies of strict confidentiality. Those who worked there understood the unwritten codes. Grupo Modelo did not leak information. Grupo Modelo did not engage in public disputes. Grupo Modelo settled matters internally, permanently, invisibly. This culture had been established in the earliest years of the company's expansion, when Pablo Diaz-Fernandez recognized that discretion was itself a form of power. The founding families, the Diaz, the Fernandez, the various branches that intermarried and consolidated control through generations, maintained residences throughout the wealthiest districts of the capital: Polanco, Lomas de Chapultepec, San Angel. These estates shared common characteristics: high walls, minimal street presence, entrances designed to reveal nothing of what lay beyond. The architecture spoke of wealth that did not require advertisement. By the night of the acquisition, many of these properties had already passed through multiple generations. Some had been subdivided among heirs. Others had been sold during periods of family restructuring. A few remained in the hands of descendants who still bore the founding names, but wielded diminishing influence over the company their ancestors created. The transition of ownership raised questions that the official narrative carefully avoided. Why had the founding families agreed to sell? What internal pressures had accumulated over decades of controlled succession? The answers lay buried in private negotiations, in family meetings held behind closed doors, in conversations that would never appear in corporate filings. Some analysts pointed to the mathematics of inheritance. Each generation multiplied the number of stakeholders. Each division of shares diluted individual control. By the early 2000s, the family ownership structure had become labyrinthine. Dozens of descendants holding fragments of authority, their interests increasingly divergent, their capacity for unified decision-making increasingly compromised. Others suggested that the families had simply recognized an inevitable reality. The global beer industry was consolidating. Independent national brewers were disappearing into multinational portfolios. To remain outside this process was to accept eventual marginalization. The sale, from this perspective, represented pragmatic surrender rather than defeat. But pragmatism rarely explains the full weight of such decisions. Behind the financial calculations lay decades of accumulated tension, rivalries between family branches, disputes over succession, disagreements about strategy that had been suppressed rather than resolved. The culture of silence that protected Grupo Modelo from external scrutiny had also prevented internal conflicts from finding resolution. The headquarters on Javier Barros Sierra would continue operating after the acquisition. The Corona brand would continue its global expansion under new ownership. The name Modelo would persist on bottles consumed across 6 continents. What vanished was something less tangible, a particular relationship between family, company, and nation that had defined Mexican brewing for generations. Pablo Diaz Fernandez arrived in Mexico at the age of 15, carrying little more than the particular hunger that displacement creates. The year was 1902. Spain offered limited prospects for a young man from the modest regions of León. The Americas promised reinvention. He crossed the Atlantic with thousands of other immigrants who would quietly reshape the commercial landscape of their adopted country. The Mexico that received him was still governed by Porfirio Diaz, still operating under the illusion of permanent stability. Foreign investment flowed freely. European immigrants found opportunities in commerce, manufacturing, and trade. The young Pablo Diaz Fernandez began as many immigrants began, working in established businesses, learning the mechanisms of Mexican commerce, accumulating the knowledge that would eventually serve larger ambitions. He possessed qualities that his later success would obscure beneath layers of mythology: a capacity for patient observation, an understanding that relationships, properly cultivated, generated returns that pure capital could not match, a willingness to wait, to position, to move only when circumstances aligned. These were not the characteristics of a visionary entrepreneur. They were the instincts of a survivor who understood that permanence required foundation. The brewing industry in early 20th century Mexico remained fragmented. Regional producers dominated local markets. Distribution networks were primitive. Quality varied dramatically. German immigrants had established several operations, bringing European techniques to Mexican ingredients. But no single company had achieved national scope. No brand commanded recognition beyond its immediate territory. Cervecería Modelo was founded in 1925, though the precise circumstances of its establishment remain partially obscured by decades of corporate mythology. The official histories speak of visionary founders recognizing untapped potential. The reality involved more complex negotiations, partnerships formed and dissolved, capital assembled from multiple sources, early struggles that tested the commitment of everyone involved. Pablo Diaz Fernandez was not among the original founders. His entry into the company came later, through channels that the sanitized corporate histories rarely detail. What matters is that by the early 1930s, he had achieved a position of decisive influence. The mechanisms of this ascent, whether through investment, strategic alliance, or the quiet accumulation of shares from struggling partners, left few traces in the public record. The headquarters established during these years reflected the emerging corporate philosophy: functionality over ostentation, security over accessibility. The buildings that housed Modelo's operations were designed to contain rather than display. Visitors were managed carefully. Information flowed through controlled channels. The architecture itself embodied a conviction that business was conducted best when conducted invisibly. This approach extended to the personal estates that prosperity made possible. As Diaz Fernandez accumulated wealth, he invested in properties throughout Mexico City's emerging elite districts. These residences shared the same aesthetic restraint as the corporate facilities: High walls, gated entrances, gardens that could not be observed from public streets. The message was consistent. What happens within these boundaries is not your concern. The 1930s and 40s represented years of methodical expansion. While other Mexican industries struggled with political instability and economic uncertainty, Grupo Modelo grew steadily. New brewing facilities, expanded distribution, gradual penetration of markets previously dominated by regional competitors. The growth was never explosive. It was incremental, systematic, designed to avoid the attention that rapid expansion inevitably attracted. Diaz-Fernandez understood that in Mexico, visibility carried risks. Governments changed, policies shifted. Enterprises that grew too prominent became targets for regulation, taxation, or outright appropriation. The revolution had demonstrated what happened when wealth concentrated too visibly. The lesson was clear: prosper quietly, or risk losing everything. This philosophy shaped every aspect of the company's development. Labor relations were managed to prevent the conflicts that generated headlines. Political connections were maintained discreetly, through channels that left no documentation. Competitors were absorbed or marginalized through methods that rarely involved public confrontation. Grupo Modelo grew not by defeating rivals, but by making their defeat seem like natural market evolution. The family structure that emerged around this growing enterprise reflected similar principles. Marriages connected brewing wealth to other established fortunes. Children were educated to understand discretion as a primary value. The Diaz family and their allied clans developed into a network characterized by internal loyalty and external opacity. Outsiders encountered polite but impenetrable barriers. By the 1950s, Grupo Modelo had achieved a position of quiet dominance in Mexican brewing. The Corona brand was establishing itself as the company's flagship product. Distribution reached most major population centers. The infrastructure for national expansion was substantially complete. Yet the company remained largely unknown outside industry circles. This was not failure of marketing. It was deliberate strategy. The estates that the founding families occupied during these decades of consolidation became more elaborate but never ostentatious. Properties in Polanco featured gardens designed by European landscapers. Residences in Lomas de Chapultepec incorporated imported materials and custom furnishings. But the external presentations remained muted. Wealth was experienced privately, shared among those who understood the codes of belonging. The transformation of Corona from regional product to international phenomenon occurred through methods that contradicted every principle of modern marketing. There were no celebrity endorsements, no elaborate advertising campaigns, no focus groups determining optimal messaging. The expansion happened through patience, positioning, and an understanding that certain products sell themselves when placed correctly. The American market opened gradually during the 1980s. Mexican immigration had created communities throughout the southwestern United States, where Corona already carried associations with home, with authenticity, with something genuine in an increasingly synthetic commercial landscape. The beer appeared in Mexican restaurants, in border towns, in neighborhoods where Spanish was spoken as frequently as English. What Grupo Modelo understood, perhaps before competitors recognized it, was that foreignness itself could become a selling point. American consumers were developing appetites for the imported, the exotic, the authentically other. Corona's clear bottle, its simple label, its association with Mexican beaches and uncomplicated pleasures, these attributes required no explanation. They communicated directly, bypassing the elaborate narratives that domestic brands constructed. The company's American distribution strategy reflected the same deliberate patience that characterized all Modelo operations. Rather than pursuing rapid national expansion, they built market by market. Regional distributors were selected carefully, relationships cultivated over years rather than months. The growth appeared organic because it was designed to appear organic. Nothing about Corona's success seemed forced or manufactured. By the late 1980s, Corona had become the best-selling imported beer in the United States. The achievement was remarkable precisely because it seemed unremarkable. No single moment marked the transition. No dramatic campaign announced the arrival. The brand simply accumulated presence until its dominance became undeniable. This was the Modelo method applied to global markets. Victory through accumulation rather than conquest. Back in Mexico City, the founding families observed this expansion from estates that had grown increasingly isolated from the operations they technically controlled. The professionalization of Grupo Modelo had created layers of management between ownership and daily decisions. Family members sat on boards, received dividends, maintained ceremonial roles. But the actual direction of the company had passed to executives who understood modern markets in ways that third-generation inheritors often did not. This transition created tensions that the culture of silence prevented from surfacing publicly. Some family members resented their marginalization. Others welcomed the freedom from operational responsibility. Disputes over strategy, over reinvestment versus distribution, over the pace of international expansion. These conflicts played out in private meetings, in conversations held within the walls of family compounds, in negotiations that left no minutes. The physical spaces occupied by the Diaz family and their allied clans during this period reflected both their wealth and their increasing distance from its sources. Estates were maintained by professional staff. Gardens were tended by workers who rarely interacted with property owners. The residences functioned as stages for a lifestyle that had become largely ceremonial, spaces where wealth was performed for an audience of similarly wealthy observers. Children raised in these environments developed complicated relationships with the fortune that surrounded them. Some pursued independent careers, treating their inheritance as safety net rather than identity. Others immersed themselves in the rituals of Mexican elite society, the clubs, the social events, the carefully managed appearances that marked belonging to a particular class. Few demonstrated the appetite for commercial struggle that had characterized their immigrant ancestors. The Modelo headquarters on Javier Barros Sierra became, during these years, increasingly autonomous from family influence. Professional managers implemented strategies developed through market research and competitive analysis. Decisions that once required family consultation were made by executives accountable primarily to performance metrics. The company's success had created the conditions for the family's irrelevance. This dynamic, prosperity-generating displacement, repeated patterns visible in family enterprises across generations and cultures. The skills required to build a company differ fundamentally from the skills required to inherit one. Pablo Diaz Fernandez had possessed the immigrant's hunger, the outsider's clarity of observation, the survivor's patience. His descendants possessed comfort, connections, and the particular blindness that accompanies assumption of permanence. Yet the family retained one crucial function. They provided legitimacy. Grupo Modelo remained in public perception a Mexican company controlled by Mexican families. This identity carried value that pure financial analysis could not capture. It distinguished Corona from foreign competitors. It generated regulatory goodwill. It connected the brand to national pride in ways that facilitated both domestic loyalty and international mystique. The maintenance of this perception required careful management. Family members appeared at appropriate corporate functions. Their names remained attached to philanthropic initiatives. The company's communications emphasized continuity, tradition, and Mexican identity. What these communications omitted was the degree to which actual control had migrated from family estates to executive suites, from inherited authority to professional expertise. The 1990s brought challenges that tested the carefully constructed equilibrium between family ownership and professional management. Mexico's economic crisis of 1994 sent tremors through every sector of the national economy. The peso collapsed, interest rates spiked, companies that had borrowed in dollars found themselves suddenly insolvent. The assumptions of stability that had guided decades of planning evaporated within weeks. Grupo Modelo survived the crisis more successfully than many competitors. The company's conservative financial practices, another legacy of Pablo Diaz Fernandez's immigrant caution, had limited exposure to the debt structures that destroyed other enterprises. International revenues, denominated in dollars, provided cushioning against peso devaluation. The crisis that devastated Mexican industry actually strengthened Modelo's relative position, but survival carried its own complications. Family members who had grown accustomed to reliable dividends found their distributions reduced. Properties that had seemed permanently secure suddenly required reconsideration. The crisis revealed how thoroughly the founding families had become dependent on a company they no longer controlled. Their wealth existed primarily on paper, in shares whose value fluctuated with market forces beyond their influence. The years following the crisis accelerated changes already underway. Professional management consolidated authority. Strategic decisions increasingly reflected global competitive pressures rather than family preferences. The company's partnership with Anheuser-Busch, established in 1993, introduced foreign influence into operations that had previously been purely Mexican. American executives participated in planning sessions. American methods shaped organizational structures. This partnership was presented publicly as collaboration between equals. The reality involved more complex power dynamics. Anheuser-Busch acquired significant minority stakes in Grupo Modelo, creating financial entanglement that would prove difficult to reverse. The American company gained access to Corona's distribution network. Modelo gained capital for expansion and theoretical protection against hostile acquisition. What remained unstated was which party benefited more from the arrangement. The founding families observed these developments from positions of diminishing leverage. Board seats remained in family hands, but the expertise required to challenge management recommendations had long since migrated elsewhere. Family members who raised objections found themselves outmaneuvered by executives who controlled information flows, who understood market dynamics, who could frame any dispute as obstruction of shareholder value. The estates in Polanco and Lomas de Chapultepec continued their quiet routines during these years of corporate transformation. Staff maintained gardens. Security monitored entrances. The physical infrastructure of wealth persisted, even as its foundations shifted. Visitors to these properties encountered environments unchanged across decades. The same furniture, the same artwork, the same careful arrangements that earlier generations had established. This preservation carried psychological significance. For families experiencing loss of control, maintaining physical continuity provided compensation. The houses remained even if influence did not. The addresses retained their prestige even if the authority they once represented had migrated elsewhere. Material stability substituted for the commercial power that had originally generated these material conditions. Within the family networks, conversations about the company's direction grew increasingly frustrated. Younger members who had pursued educations in business or finance recognized patterns that alarmed them. The partnership with Anheuser-Busch, initially presented as strategic alliance, began to resemble preliminary acquisition. Each additional stock purchase, each deepening operational integration, reduced the family's capacity for independent action. But these concerns encountered obstacles that the family's own culture had created. The tradition of discretion that protected Modelo from external scrutiny also prevented internal dissent from organizing effectively. Family members hesitant to air disagreements publicly found themselves isolated, unable to coordinate resistance, uncertain who among their relatives shared their concerns. The silence that had served the company so well now disabled its owners. The Modelo headquarters provided no assistance to family members seeking clarity. Requests for information encountered bureaucratic delays. Financial statements arrived in formats that obscured more than they revealed. The professional management that had replaced family oversight had developed institutional interests distinct from ownership interests. Their careers depended on relationships with Anheuser-Busch executives, not on satisfying shareholders whose influence had become largely ceremonial. Some family members attempted to organize. Private meetings were held in the same estates where earlier generations had planned corporate expansion. Lawyers were consulted. Financial advisors offered assessments. But these efforts consistently failed to generate unified action. The family had fragmented across too many branches, too many competing interests, too many accumulated resentments. Unity required trust, and trust had eroded through decades of suppressed conflict. The public face of Grupo Modelo during these years revealed nothing of these internal tensions. Corona continued its global expansion. New markets opened in Asia, Europe, South America. The brand achieved recognition that would have seemed impossible to the company's founders. Modelo Especial established its own following among consumers seeking alternatives to Corona's beach casual associations. The company appeared stronger than ever, precisely as its founding families grew weakest. The 2000s arrived, carrying transformations that would prove irreversible. Global brewing consolidation accelerated beyond anything previous decades had suggested. Regional champions disappeared into multinational portfolios. South African breweries merged with Miller. Interbrew combined with Ambev to create InBev. The independent landscape that had sustained companies like Grupo Modelo was vanishing, replaced by a terrain dominated by 3 or 4 global giants. Anheuser-Busch itself, long the dominant American brewer, found itself vulnerable. The company that had partnered with Modelo from a position of strength now faced pressures that altered every calculation. InBev's hostile acquisition of Anheuser-Busch in 2008 represented a seismic shift. The partnership that Modelo's management had cultivated for 15 years suddenly involved different counterparties with different priorities. The new owners, Anheuser-Busch InBev, approached the Modelo relationship with perspectives shaped by their own aggressive consolidation history. The Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate had grown through acquisition, through integration, through extraction of efficiencies from absorbed competitors. They viewed minority stakes not as permanent arrangements, but as preliminary positions awaiting completion. Their intentions regarding Modelo were never explicitly stated, but became increasingly legible. Within the family estates scattered across Mexico City, the implications of these global shifts generated new anxieties. The partnership that had once seemed protective now appeared predatory. The American ally had been absorbed by an entity with no sentimental attachment to Mexican ownership structures. Conversations that had previously focused on dividend levels and board representation began addressing existential questions about the family's future relationship with the company their ancestors built. The Modelo headquarters on Javier Barros Sierra operated during these years under conditions of permanent uncertainty. Executives who had built careers navigating the Anheuser-Busch relationship now faced counterparts whose methods differed fundamentally. The Brazilian-influenced management culture of InBev emphasized cost reduction, margin improvement, rapid integration. The patient cultivation of relationships that characterized Modelo's corporate culture encountered expectations of immediate performance. Professional management found themselves caught between competing pressures. Family shareholders, however diminished in influence, retained legal rights that could complicate transactions. InBev representatives pressed for deeper integration, for elimination of redundancies, for alignment with global operational standards. The executives who occupied the space between these demands experienced the particular stress of serving masters whose interests had become incompatible. Some family members recognized that the end had effectively arrived. The question was no longer whether control would be lost, but under what terms loss would be managed. These realists argued for negotiated surrender, achieving the best possible price, while family shares still retained leverage value. Delay, they suggested, would only weaken their position, as InBev accumulated additional shares and additional influence. Others refused this assessment. The company remained profitable. The brands retained value. Mexican regulations offered some protection against unwanted foreign acquisition. Resistance remained possible, they insisted, if only the family could unify behind clear objectives. These optimists proposed strategies for maintaining independence, seeking alternative partners, restructuring ownership, appealing to nationalist sentiment that might generate regulatory barriers. The debates occurred in private settings that preserved the family's tradition of discretion. Living rooms in Polanco estates hosted conversations that would determine the fate of a commercial empire. Gardens in Lomas de Chapultepec provided backdrop for arguments that extended across months without resolution. The walls that protected these discussions from public observation also prevented the external pressure that might have forced decision. Meanwhile, the company continued operations that seemed disconnected from the ownership struggles occurring above them. Corona maintained its position as the leading imported beer in the United States. Modelo Especial grew rapidly among American consumers, discovering its distinct character. International expansion continued in markets across Asia and Europe. The commercial machine functioned independently of the family conflicts that technically governed it. This disconnection illustrated how thoroughly Grupo Modelo had evolved beyond its founding structure. The company's success no longer depended on family guidance. The brands possessed momentum that ownership changes could not immediately alter. The distribution networks, the production facilities, the market relationships, these assets would retain value regardless of whose names appeared on shareholder registries. The family's relevance had become primarily financial rather than operational. The estates themselves seemed to acknowledge this transformation. Properties that had once functioned as extensions of corporate power, venues for business entertainment, settings for strategic discussions, had become purely residential. The executives who actually directed Modelo's operations lived elsewhere, socialized in different circles, built relationships with international counterparts rather than family patriarchs. The geography of power had shifted away from the addresses that founding wealth had established. Some family compounds showed signs of deferred maintenance during these uncertain years. Decisions about renovation or repair required clarity about future resources that no one possessed. Gardens that had once employed multiple full-time staff operated with reduced crews. Interiors preserved arrangements from earlier decades, not from aesthetic choice, but from financial hesitation. The physical fabric of family wealth began reflecting the psychological uncertainty of its owners. The younger generation experienced these years with particular intensity. Raised with expectations of inheritance, they now faced futures of diminished certainty. Some accelerated their own career development, seeking independence from fortunes that might not materialize as anticipated. Others retreated into the social structures that wealth had always provided, finding in club memberships and society events the stability that family finances no longer guaranteed. The final negotiations began in earnest during 2011. Anheuser-Busch InBev had accumulated sufficient position to make their intentions undeniable. The question was no longer whether acquisition would occur, but what price family shareholders could extract and what conditions they might attach to their surrender. Lawyers representing various family branches engaged with corporate counsel in sessions that stretched across months. The complexity of ownership structure that had evolved over generations now created obstacles to efficient transaction. Dozens of family members held shares through various trusts and holding entities. Each branch possessed distinct interests, distinct tax considerations, distinct relationships with company management. Assembling consensus required negotiations within the family, as intricate as negotiations with the acquiring party. Some shareholders demanded premium valuations that reflected Corona's global brand equity. Others prioritized speed, seeking liquidity before market conditions might deteriorate. A minority attempted to attach conditions preserving family involvement in governance, seeking board seats or advisory roles that would maintain some connection to the enterprise their ancestors built. These competing priorities generated conflicts that the family's tradition of privacy could no longer contain. The estates that housed these negotiations bore witness to conversations that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. In the same rooms where Pablo Diaz Fernandez had once planned expansion, his descendants now debated terms of withdrawal. The portraits and photographs that decorated these spaces depicted men who had built something from nothing. Their heirs struggled to preserve anything from everything. Legal teams working on the transaction occupied conference rooms in the Modelo headquarters with increasing frequency. Documents accumulated in volumes that required dedicated storage. The machinery of corporate acquisition generated paperwork that documented every aspect of the transfer: asset valuations, liability assessments, employee agreements, regulatory filings. The company's passage from Mexican to Belgian-Brazilian control left comprehensive records, even as the human dimensions of that passage remained private. The Mexican government's role in reviewing the transaction introduced additional uncertainty. Antitrust regulators possessed authority to block or modify foreign acquisitions that threatened competitive markets. Nationalist politicians raised objections to the sale of a company so closely identified with Mexican identity. For months, the possibility remained that regulatory intervention might preserve independence that family shareholders had already decided to surrender. These regulatory proceedings generated the only public discussion of the acquisition's implications. Economists debated market concentration. Politicians questioned whether foreign ownership served national interests. Journalists investigated the founding families, producing profiles that revealed more about their wealth than decades of deliberate obscurity had permitted. The silence that had protected Grupo Modelo for generations finally broke under the pressure of transactional requirements. The families experienced this sudden visibility with discomfort that approached trauma. Reporters stationed themselves outside estate entrances. Photographs appeared in publications that had never previously acknowledged their existence. The privacy that wealth had always purchased proved insufficient against the news value of a $20 billion transaction. For the first time, the names Diaz and Fernandez appeared in contexts their bearers could not control. Within the compounds, responses varied. Some family members refused all media contact, retreating further into protected spaces, instructing staff to deny their presence to any inquiries. Others recognized opportunity in the attention, using interviews to shape narratives that preserved family dignity. A few younger members, less attached to traditions of invisibility, engaged with journalists in ways that horrified their elders. The headquarters on Javier Barros Sierra operated during this period under conditions of perpetual scrutiny. Employees encountered journalists in surrounding streets. Executives found their movements tracked, their meetings documented, their associations analyzed. The institutional culture of discretion that had defined Modelo for decades proved inadequate preparation for the attention that accompanied its absorption into a global conglomerate. Regulatory approval came in stages across 2012. Mexican authorities extracted concessions regarding domestic competition, requiring divestitures that preserved some independent presence in the national market. American regulators imposed their own conditions, concerned about concentration in imported beer segments. Each approval moved the transaction closer to completion, while reducing possibilities for reversal. The final signatures occurred without public ceremony. No photographs documented the moment when family representatives endorsed documents transferring their shares to Anheuser-Busch InBev. The transaction that concluded nearly 90 years of family ownership happened in legal offices, witnessed only by attorneys and notaries whose professional obligations required presence. The ending arrived not with drama, but with procedural formality. Funds transferred to accounts held by various family trusts and individuals. The amounts were substantial by any ordinary measure, hundreds of millions of dollars, distributed across dozens of recipients. Yet money provided incomplete compensation for what had been surrendered. The families retained wealth, but lost identity. They remained rich, but became irrelevant to the enterprise that had defined their position for generations. The estates in Polanco and Lomas de Chapultepec continued their existence largely unchanged in the immediate aftermath. Staff maintained routines established across decades. Gardens flowered according to seasonal patterns, indifferent to ownership transitions. The physical infrastructure of family wealth persisted, even as its commercial foundation had been permanently removed. These properties would endure, but their significance had fundamentally altered. Some family members departed Mexico in the months following completion. Properties in Miami, Madrid, and other international destinations received new permanent residents. The transaction had provided resources for global mobility that earlier generations had never pursued. The attachment to Mexico City that had characterized the founding families weakened as the commercial reasons for that attachment disappeared. Others remained, navigating relationships with a company that no longer required their involvement. The Modelo name persisted on buildings, on products, on corporate communications, but the connection between that name and the families who had created it became increasingly historical, a matter of archives rather than living relationship. They became ancestors while still alive, commemorated in company materials that documented origins without acknowledging present irrelevance. The years following the acquisition settled into patterns that no one had anticipated. Anheuser-Busch InBev implemented operational changes with the efficiency their reputation promised. Redundancies were eliminated. Processes were standardized. The particular culture that had characterized Grupo Modelo, its deliberate pace, its emphasis on relationships, its tolerance for inefficiency in service of loyalty, gave way to metrics-driven management that recognized no such accommodations. The headquarters on Javier Barros Sierra continued functioning, though its significance within the global corporate structure diminished steadily. Decisions that had once originated in Mexico City now arrived from São Paulo, from New York, from Leuven. The building that had represented the center of a commercial empire became a regional office, implementing strategies developed elsewhere, reporting to executives who had never walked its corridors. Former employees described the transformation in terms that avoided direct criticism, but conveyed unmistakable loss. The feeling was different, they said. The sense of belonging to something specifically Mexican, something connected to particular families and particular histories, had evaporated. They now worked for a corporation that happened to operate in Mexico rather than a Mexican company that had achieved global reach. The distinction mattered more than organizational charts could capture. The founding family estates entered their own period of quiet transition. Some properties were sold to new wealth, technology fortunes, financial services executives, the beneficiaries of Mexico's evolving economy. Others remained in family hands, but housed members whose connection to Grupo Modelo had become purely memorial. They lived in spaces built by brewing money, while pursuing lives entirely disconnected from brewing. The gardens still received maintenance. Security personnel still monitored entrances. The physical presentation of these properties changed little in the years following the acquisition. But visitors who had known these spaces in earlier eras detected differences that defied easy description. An absence of purpose, perhaps. A quality of preservation rather than habitation. The estates had become monuments to something concluded rather than settings for something ongoing. Corona continued its global trajectory under new ownership. The brand achieved penetrations into markets that family management had never prioritized. The clear bottle appeared in convenience stores across Asia, in supermarkets throughout Europe, in venues that Pablo Diaz-Fernandez could never have imagined. Commercial success continued, amplified by resources and distribution networks that only global consolidation could provide. Whether this success vindicated the acquisition or merely demonstrated what had been surrendered remained a question without definitive answer. The families who had sold their shares watched the brand's continued growth from positions of comfortable irrelevance. They retained wealth sufficient for generations. They had lost something that wealth could not replace, a relationship between family name and national enterprise that had provided identity beyond mere affluence. The silence that had characterized Grupo Modelo throughout its independent existence persisted in altered form. The families did not discuss their feelings about the transaction publicly. They did not grant interviews reflecting on what had been lost. They maintained the discretion that generations had established, even though the commercial rationale for that discretion had disappeared. Silence had become habit rather than strategy. In the archives of the company, documents preserve the record of what the founding families built. Photographs show ceremonies, groundbreakings, celebrations of milestones that marked the company's growth. The faces in these images belong to men who believed they were establishing something permanent, something that would carry their names forward indefinitely. They could not have known that permanence was never available, that every empire contains the conditions of its own conclusion. The estates remain standing throughout Mexico City. Their walls still separate private gardens from public streets. Their gates still open to admit residents whose surnames occasionally echo those of the founders. But the connection between these properties and the company that financed their construction exists now only in memory, in documents, in stories that fewer people each year remember to tell. What endures is the beer itself. Bottles opened in sunlight across 6 continents, carrying a name that once meant something specific and now means something universal. The transformation from Mexican family enterprise